Right guys, we might keep going again. I'm Dave Opar. I want to just echo Tony's sentiment earlier and thank Dave and all the guys here at Lesson for putting on what to us is a little bit of the extraordinary thing to do here in Australia. We probably wouldn't put such a crowd of as we are over here. I'm going to show you guys, hopefully relatively quickly, the research that we've done looking at eccentric strength using our Nordic hamstring device as a predictor of future injury risk. Really, there's 3 studies in Australian rules football, in soccer or football as you guys call it here, and then also in rugby union. 3 of which follow very, very similar designs and outlines. The results are somewhat corroboratory as well, although there's some differences in the rugby union guys. Before I launch into it though, you'll see there'll be papers, whether it's a first author myself or Ryan and also Matty Paul, but they are really large studies that take a hell of a lot of work and effort and manpower from everyone in our group. So it's a group of people who really work fantastically well together to pull up some of the nice pretty pictures that you guys are going to see here later today. And particularly on that point, Morgan Williams, who you don't have to turn around, he's at the back of the room. He's our stats guru. Any of the things that look quite interesting and are really advanced is all the hard work and great work that Morgs does. So I think for a long period of time, the world-class work that we were doing was really based on the statistical modelling and analysis that Morgs was doing. Probably fails to get some of the kudos some of the time as well. But it's really a collaborative and group effort what I'm going to present to you guys here for the next 15 minutes or so. But really all these studies have, this is the major focus. So our markers of eccentric hamstring strength, and we might split that into strong versus weak athletes or a sliding scale of athletes, or athletes who we might consider asymmetrical, that might go from 10, 15 or 20% between them imbalances. Are they individuals or athletes who are at risk of future hamstring strain injury? And of course the major difference that we've introduced is just simply that we're measuring that in a field testing device that's relatively quick and efficient. But I think the other thing that's particularly interesting, and again the great work from Morgan, is looking at the interaction effect between these variables. So looking at strength and imbalance and whether they have an interrelationship with an athlete's age or their history of prior hamstring strain injury. When we look at prior hamstring strain injury, we're really looking at a 12-month history. So if we have athletes who are stronger or display lesser between-limb imbalances, are they able to offset the non-modifiable risk factor of being off? And then similarly, are these guys who have a history of injury or assumed to be at elevated risk, can we offset the risk of that prior injury by looking at augmenting their strength and minimising their between-limb imbalance? So very generally, we take age, height and weight data. Across the 3 studies, we've often cherry-picked a few different informations as well. Looked at player position as an example, or years of experience in the competition or elite experience. But these are the variables that we stick with all through the 3 of them. We look at 12-month injury history, obviously confined to lower limb. The one exception to that is for ACL injuries, we have a look at any ACL injuries that occurred within that athlete's career. Now we also have a look at things like graft type and rehabilitation time as well. Majority of the information, or all the information I'll show you guys today in terms of injury history, will focus on those with a prior hamstring injury in the past 12 months. And then depending on the competition, we'll get various information on the prospectively occurring hamstring strain injury data. So locality and mechanism, severity, which may come from imaging data. So for example, the AFL will always use MRI as a measure of severity and then also a diagnosis. But some of the severity markers we also get from clinical notes as well, from the physiotherapy or medical staff. In terms of the data, we'll initially go through for each study univariate analysis. So looking just at strength or just at imbalance. And with that data, go through using what's called a receiver operator characteristic curve. Basically that samples through the data to give us a cut point. So if we're thinking about strength, it cuts our group into what we might call weak and strong. The important thing to realise with these ROC curves is what they're trying to do is not split the group in half, so you've got 50% above and 50% below necessarily, but they're looking for the point in that sample that has the best predictive capability. So we're able to predict or detect the greatest amount of true positives, or predict the guys that are going to be injured, and minimise the false negatives and false positives. So that rock curve basically will cut our groups into two separate portions. We'll call it weak or strong, symmetrical or asymmetrical, and from that we can have a look at their relative risk. But then with Morgs' handiwork, we can also do multivariate logistic regression work as well. And this is really where we get into these interaction effects. So what is the impact that strength might have on some of these non-modifiable factors? That's the general flow across all three of the studies, and I think now we're on to the sports-specific studies. This is a study in the AFL, which has already been published earlier this year, late last year, in Medicine and Science and Sports and Exercise. For those of you that don't know a lot about Australian rules football, it's a sport played on an oval field. Okay? In length, it's somewhere in the vicinity of 150 to 180 or 190 metres. There's 18 players on each team at any one time, and they play 4 quarters of 20 minutes of playing time. A little bit like stoppage time in football or soccer here. Typically the quarters tend to run for anywhere up to 28 to 30 odd minutes. They tend to be on deck for about 120 minutes per game. There are 3 interchange players who can come on and off at will. There is a loose cap on that, but it doesn't seem that many of the clubs scrape that across the 4 quarters. And there's 1 substitute player who can come in and then obviously needs to be replaced. Or a player who comes off can then be replaced. So it does share a lot of similar characteristics with elite level soccer. Okay, these guys do a hell of a lot of high speed running, a lot of accelerations and decelerations and change of direction. Obviously the addition of that is some of the high intensity collisions that occur, which is probably more similar to rugby. But this is just a snapshot of various AFL footballers who have gone down with hamstring injuries in recent times, and it's forever and a day. Like 21 years when the AFL injury report or injury audit has been going on. It's the primary injury that occurs in that sport by a long way. Okay? It causes the most number of games missed, and we've found that AFL clubs in general are paying an extra player on their list per year who's ultimately unavailable due to hamstring strain injury. So it might sound like small fry in the world of Premier League soccer, but about $250,000 lost basically in efficiency. Being able to prevent those injuries ultimately could save them money. Now the evidence base for non-modifiable factors, obviously the things we consider that can't be changed, is similar across a lot of these sports, and the evidence in Australian rules football is no different. So age and previous history increases your risk. Okay? In terms of being old in Australian football, I can find that the cut point is about 23 or 24 years of age, which makes some of us feel particularly old. But the prior injury is typically looking at a year or 2 injury history data. But often, obviously, modifiable factors are things that we often focus on as something we can try and intervene with or try and change. And if we look at AFL in terms of the evidence base related to strength, and strength as a risk factor, until recent times in some of our work, were 2 studies, and you can see more than 15 years ago. The first one by Orchard was a study that used isokinetic dynamometry, looked at concentric hamstring strength only, hamstring quad ratios and those types of things. And John found that there was a risk or greater risk of injury in those that display concentric weakness. Similar study, slightly larger, a year later. They had elite level athletes but also mixed in some lower level state-based players as well, from Kim Bennell. These guys also introduced eccentric isokinetic testing, and across concentric and eccentric contractions found no association with an increased risk of injury. So it really left us for a long period of time where the evidence base for strength was mixed, and if you have a partial view, you might even say that it's negative. And certainly, although it's a different sport, the Crozier paper in soccer in 2008, which I'll touch on a little later, probably sparked or re-sparked some interest in AFL circles relating to strength and risk of hamstring injury. So, 5 elite teams were in this study. 5 out of, I think it was 17 at the time, there's now 18 teams in the elite AFL competition. So it gave us 186 players. These guys were assessed at the start of pre-season training. Their eccentric hamstring strength, so we're looking at the 2013 pre-season, which actually places in November of 2012. Now on top of that, we also took a measure at the end of their pre-season. So it's a 2 or 3 month period and window in AFL where they have a relatively lengthy pre-season compared to some of the European sports. So we were able to look at start of pre-season and then also end of pre-season strength measures to see whether the progression and change across that period had any influence on their risk. So in terms of the location of injury, and fortunately we have to be saddest to some extent because getting 28 injuries across our 5 clubs actually makes the study far better than if we got a lot less. So there's some joy in that for us. And the split of those injuries is mostly centred around biceps femoris, and this is mostly biceps femoris long head, which supports most of the previous literature in AFL. If we have a look then at the relative risk, remember we're using these receiver operator curves, so don't think that this data is indicative of the median score of the population. The average score is actually a little bit higher than that. But this is start of pre-season data and using above or below 256 newtons of force as the cut point. And we can see here on the y-axis what we're looking at here is hamstring strain injury frequency in those 2 groups. And so if we take the frequency from those 2 groups and compare them, you can see that that weaker group is about a 2.5-fold increase in terms of their risk from that point onwards. Okay, so at the start of pre-season with that measure, all the way through pre-season into the competitive season, which runs for about 4 or 5 months. We normalise that to body weight, body mass. It's a common question that we get asked in terms of its influence on the scores and on the data. You can see here again, think of a weak versus a strong group. And again, we see a relatively similar relationship there. That weak group is at an elevated level of risk compared to the strong group. Now, in terms of the other 2 studies, this is where the AFL study diverges from those significantly. So we're going to have a look at between limb imbalance or asymmetry. We're using what are just commonly employed cut points here. We're going to have a look at 10, 15 and 20%. So obviously we consider in this case here symmetrical versus asymmetrical, and looking at hamstring strain injury frequency here. So whether we look at a 10% difference, comparing these 2 groups, whilst they are different, you can see the 95% confidence intervals there crossed as 1. So we say there's no real difference in the relative risk of injury for future hamstring strain injury in those 2 groups. And that relationship persists if we went up to 15% imbalance or if we went up to 20% imbalance. Okay, so the trend of imbalance and having greater imbalance doesn't seem to hold true in leg strain football. So it appears that for these guys it was more about strength, and as Tony touched on before, we might assume that these are relatively strong athletes on the sporting landscape in Australia. They probably play lip service to them with some of their eccentric conditioning. If we then look at the end of pre-season, again we're looking just at a force measure here, absolute terms. The cut point where it's most predictive goes up a little bit. Obviously there's a gradual progression throughout pre-season where the entirety of the cohort gets stronger. But we can see now if you're classified as being weak at the end of pre-season, then you're above a 4-fold increased risk of future hamstring strain injury. So if you're weak at the start of pre-season, imperative that you start to try and pour work into those guys to get their level of eccentric strength up, because if you leave them in this bin when it comes to the competitive season, then they're in real strife. Exactly the same story again when we normalise to body weight, body mass. And if we look at imbalance at the end of pre-season, you might suggest that this might be a clinically significant increase in relative risk. From a statistical standpoint, sometimes we can be a slave to that overtly and overtly. There's no difference between those 2 groups. And again, that carries on across all of those levels of imbalance. So that's interesting, and I'm sure all of you guys can see that the cut points that we use, particularly for the force measures, aren't necessarily arbitrary. They are black and white, broken up into a weak and a strong group. And I think the work of Morgan Williams looking at these interaction effects is particularly interesting. So we think that a history of prior hamstring strain in the preceding 12 months is one of those non-modifiable risk factors. What we've got here is an interaction effect that has a look at hamstring strain injury status. And remember, this is their previous 12 months, compared to their levels of eccentric hamstring strength. Obviously starting down here at the very weak end of the spectrum, here towards then the very strong end of the spectrum. We have the mean of this cohort somewhere in this vicinity here. And from that, Morgan's been able to go through and then model the probability of future hamstring strain injury in those two groups, taking into account variations in the level of eccentric hamstring strain. Obviously, a score of 1 here is certain. A score of 0 here says there's absolutely no chance of a prospective hamstring strain injury occurring. So the key take-home message, I think, from this really is that, look, a history of previous injury does expose you to a greater risk of future injury. That's only if you couple that with low levels of eccentric hamstring strain. And we've got fantastic scope to be able to offset that risk in what we might think of our red flag athletes, if we're able to change what we think is one of their real key modifiable factors. Age is the other of those big non-modifiable factors, and essentially you can see here the same relationship. So we're just looking here at athletes 10, 25, 50, 75 and 90% of the cohort. And again, you can see the exact same thing on the x-axis, eccentric hamstring strength, weak all the way to strong, and probability of hamstring strain injury here on the y-axis. And again, if you're old, you are exposed to a greater level of risk. But again, that can be offset almost at this cut point here at 300 newtons, which has become a bit of an unofficial marker for the AFL clubs to use to get their athletes happy. Okay, as you guys are well aware, obviously this is a concern and injury of high prevalence in soccer as well. The literature in terms of non-modifiable factors is pretty much in line with what we see in Australian rules football. So the UEFA injury group and then Woods before that defines age and prior history, bumps up your risk. If we have a look at then the evidence related to strength, the Crozier one was an interesting study from a number of perspectives because I think it stimulated a lot of people into thinking that perhaps strength was something that needed to be put back on the agenda. The Crozier ratios and the data they present in those papers are a little bit old, they're a little bit hard to follow, and often you might think that that's perhaps then looking for something that wasn't necessarily there. There's a couple of places, not only around town here, but overseas and internationally, that have used Crozier's ratios now for a number of years prospectively and have found no predictive capacity from those ratios. Now, Tony's point earlier is that perhaps partly down to their methodology, which I think can be true in some of these labs as well. But I think it's raised the profile of strength and isokinetic strength, but I don't think it's necessarily given us all of the answers. Of course, neither should it. This second study, which I've got no chance of pronouncing that surname, found imbalance was a key factor for elite soccer players. I think this is Greek or elite Greek soccer players. So I think still the body of evidence for strength, which is something that we see heavily supported in the randomised controlled trials at that sub-elite level, is still not really that heavily flushed, certainly at the elite level. So we have what we like to think is an elite soccer competition back home, but it's not really. There's 10 teams in the top tier of Australian football. So for this study, we had 7 of those 10 teams participating. We scrapped the goalkeeping because there was almost 0 chance of doing a hamstring. And so from those 7 teams, we had 131 players. Measures of eccentric strength this time only at the start of pre-season because of the geographical limitations that we have with soccer in Australia, where it's spread all the way around the country. It's logistically very difficult to get back to them 2 or 3 times per year. The AFL is great because we've got 10 elite teams within the space of about 20 kilometres in Victoria and in Melbourne. So eccentric strength measures just at the start of pre-season. Again, focus here on biceps femoris and again biceps femoris long head muscles, mostly confirmed with MRI, although some just from clinical assessments as well. Again, 23 hamstring strain injuries, which is pretty good for us and not so good for clubs. In terms of their univariate relative risk, one thing to note here is that with that rock curve cut-off, that cut point is now greater than what we saw with the AFL guys. Now, the average of the Australian soccer athletes compared to the AFL guys, it's actually slightly lower. Okay, so it's not to say necessarily that the soccer guys are stronger, but the cut point where it became most predictive or most able to distinguish between guys that would and would not go on to be injured was at this 300 mark. And again, we can see that in the soccer guys, weakness at the start of pre-season, or being in that weak category, increase your risk close to 3-5. Now, the benefit that we had in this study compared to the AFL study was that Ryan's going to show you some data in a moment where we took some architectural measures, and part of that is we've got to take some limb length measurements as well. So we're actually able then to look at some torque data and to see whether a measure of torque gave us greater indication as to individuals' level of relative risk. Now, one thing you'll notice straight away from here, obviously the values here are different, they're on average about 0.45 in terms of their shank length. But you'll notice that the frequency in both of those groups goes down a little bit, and that's just because we had fewer athletes where we had shank data for. So the full sample that we have for torque data is actually slightly smaller than what we have just for force data. But you can see with that torque data, above or below 145 Newton meters, you can see that the relative risk is now pushing up to the mid-4s. So really, whichever way you look at it, strength in these guys at the start of pre-season was something that was able to distinguish guys who would go on to be at risk. And if you're able to reliably and accurately take their shank measurements as well, probably gave you even greater insight. Dissimilar to what we saw in the AFL though, the between limb imbalances tends to show what you might think is a predictable trend. At above or below 10% imbalance in strength, no difference in our soccer guys. But as we start to build our way up to then 15%, you can see we're starting to nudge up that relative risk, although the confidence will still cost us 1. And by the time we get to 20% above or below imbalance, for the soccer guys back home, that's when that relative risk across that magical 1 marker became a significant marker of relative risk of future injury risk. Well, again, some great work here from Morgs. I apologise for the quality of these figures because the last few weeks of the season are still wrapping up. So these are some figures that are being produced on the move and on the run. But again, eccentric hamstring strain, the probability of hamstring strain injury. Looking at the guys with no history of hamstring strain in the prior 12 months, again we can see that they're at risk if they're weak, but if we can get them strong, then their risk is significantly reduced, as you might expect from the relative risk data. But if we then plot again over the top of that those guys with 12-month histories, we can see that the gap and the divergence between those two groups is really offset when we start to get down to impressive and more impressive levels of strength, like some of the guys in here are reporting. And again, the same thing with age. Exactly the same figure, again cutting it up in 10, 25, 50, 75, and 90% of the age brackets. But as we build through, we can see that gradual increase where the older athletes are at risk when they're weak. But if they're at what we might suggest is an acceptable level of strength, getting down into the 300 and 400 marks, significantly offset that risk in our elite soccer players. And so, actually, flip back there. I think one important thing to take in mind and consider here is if we were to think back home, our soccer and our AFL boys, in terms of the strength spectrum across the sports that we have there, they're probably at the mid to lower end. So it's not surprising to have athletes that fill out across the 100, 200, 300 and 400 mark in those sports. But notice for both the soccer guys and for also the AFL guys, tend to get to a point where that probability of hamstring strain injury plateaus and levels off. So it might suggest that athletes who are more strength and power based are actually just generally going to have lower risk of injury because they sit further along to the right of this curve. And so for us, the best group of athletes that we can get access to back home are those in elite level rugby union and the Super Rugby competition. And so, again, simple story here. Most of the work comes from a group out of the UK, I believe, with Brooks, and their non-modifiable factors of age and previous history. In terms of their modifiable factors, the evidence base is relatively small. From some of the work of Brooks, what they've looked at is where the teams did or didn't implement that Nordic hamstring exercise. And so there's one study to suggest that the implementation of that exercise may have had some ability to minimise the risk of an athlete or an athlete sustaining a hamstring strain injury. But as we well know back home, clubs telling you that they implement eccentric conditioning as a preventative strategy is something that they can say quite easily and can implement quite poorly. So just because clubs tell you that they have implemented something doesn't necessarily mean that it follows best practice or does exactly what you think it might. So the major difference between the previous two studies and this is that we had a smaller batch of elite athletes from 3 Super Rugby teams, and then supplemented that with more athletes from state-based teams who we might consider sub-elite, and then also some guys at Colts level, which is sort of under 18s, under 21s type level. And again, eccentric strength, 2014 start of pre-season, so similar to the soccer stadium in terms of the time point. 20 strings, again, majority of bicycle span, and most of them is high-speed running, and backs more likely than forwards to sustain those injuries. Here lies one of perhaps the limitations of the rock curve for some of these strength athletes, because when we put through a cut point here and said above or below 268 newtons, which we think about the previous figures that we've seen for cohorts of athletes that we think are probably weaker, these are similar and in one case lower than the soccer guys. And remember, it's not reflective of the average level of strength in that group. It's that rock curve trying to find the point where that variable is best able to predict risk of injury. And at that weak versus strong group, there were no athletes in that weak group, or no athletes in that weak group that went on to sustain an injury. Now, it's because part of that rock curve is that it's cut that group into a very, very small lower end, and so the vast majority are in a very large upward bandwidth. So if 0 versus something else, it doesn't allow us then really to calculate relative risk because we're comparing 0 or nothing to something else. But if we go through and have a look at force normalised to mass, we can see that weak versus strong in our rugby union guys didn't have any real influence on relative risk. So you might make the argument that for these more strength power dominant or athletes, that they sit further along the right hand side of that curve. So for them, it doesn't appear that strength is the thing that's limiting or increasing their risk of injury. What we did find though, again in line with some of the soccer data, was that imbalance was the thing that started to become more distinguishable for these guys. So it wasn't necessarily there above or below 10%, but when we got to above or below 15% and then went up further to above or below 20%, when these guys had imbalances and were asymmetrical, you can see there it's almost not quite probably a linear rise in their relative risk as you go from 10 to 15 and then 20%. And so I think the best analogy here for these guys perhaps suggests that if you're weak, it doesn't matter which limb is weakest, you're probably in strife regardless. When you start to get strong, that's perhaps when asymmetrical force profile starts to play a bit more of a part. And you can see that the relative risk here for imbalance is the highest that we've got out of any cohort. And this is, again, work from Morgan and Matty Bourne, but this is now looking at between the imbalance as that X value, and then obviously probability of hamstring strain injury here on the Y. Again, history of injury or no history, and you can see again here the same story. You've got disparity between those two groups that starts to get even greater when their level between them imbalance or asymmetry starts to get greater. So the key take-home message there for these strong guys is probably the focus then needs to start shifting a little bit more towards symmetrical force profiles. So I think the quickest summary I can give in terms of the Australian football and the soccer guys is certainly strength is an influencing factor, and I think the interaction and influence that it has on the things we consider non-modifiable is a really powerful and important thing to consider. So whether it's age or previous history, it seems that we can offset the risk associated with those by getting these lesser strength athletes a little bit stronger. In terms of the rugby guys, it seems that 15% or above imbalance was that point where we started to see risk go up, and previous injury had an interaction with that. And we didn't really get anything out of the age spectrum or the age profile from the rugby union guys, which again is disparate to what we've seen in some of the previous stuff in the other sports. Alright, that's all from me. We'll probably take questions as a group together at the end, but I'll pass over now to Ryan, who's going to talk about PhD, we're doing in process.